Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 3 on USA conflict 1954 to 1975. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, it's about education, and it's about something called a court case, the Brown versus Topeka court case. And hopefully as the video goes on, I'll explain what that was all about. But before we start, ladies and gentlemen, a quick quiz question. Do you know what was the Christmas number 1 in the year 1979 when I was 18 years old? 1979. What was Christmas number 1? Was it a song about Santa? Was it a song about the reindeer, ladies and gentlemen? Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? No. 1979, a rather strange subject for a Christmas number 1. It's by a band called Pink Floyd. We don't need no education. Wow. Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. Interesting song. And the video itself, very, very good video. Cartoon in places, and the teacher is shown turning into a hammer, beating the children into school. Teachers as a hammer, that could never work, particularly if your name is Mr. O'Toole. Oh, terrible, terrible joke. Now, we could say we don't need no education, but there were many, many people in the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, who were desperate for an education. And this video, the Brown versus Topeka court case, is all about civil rights and education. Now then, I suppose to help you remember, let's use these words: education, segregation, legislation, change the nation. Because you could argue that the Brown versus Topeka court case, ladies and gentlemen, was all about the law, because it's in court, and it's all about changing the nation, changing the United States of America, as we'll see. Now then, do you remember 1896? I mentioned it in my previous videos, the Supreme Court decision on Plessy versus Ferguson. Do you remember that? Of course you do. Well, let's remove Santa, a bit too early for Christmas. Now, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision said that it was constitutional, it was legal to have segregation in the United States of America, provided that things were separate but equal. And one of the things that was segregated or kept separate between white people and black people was education or schools. Now, in 1954, the start of our course, the NAACP, do you remember that civil rights group? National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. They challenged this in the court, in the Supreme Court, because they argued, look, we have schools for white people, schools for black people, separate, but they are not equal. And they had some evidence for this. For example, in South Carolina, 3 times as much money was spent on white schools as on schools for the black children. So they're beginning to get evidence. After World War II, black teachers earned 78% of the pay of white teachers, and that had actually improved. So imagine what it was like beforehand. So they got evidence to present to the Supreme Court that basically the black schools were not equal. A young student called Linda Brown, her father was a church minister, and Linda Brown and her father said, look, I do not want to have to travel far to the school that takes black people because I have to pass these schools. Now these schools only take white people, but it's not equal. So we get the NAACP and their lawyers challenging this in the Supreme Court. Now, what happened in this case? Now let's have a look. I've got for you, and I apologise for my terrible drawing, a map, very rough map of the United States of America. Okay, now on this map, ladies and gentlemen, I can show you the states in America where we have the separate schools. It's this part here, the southern states. That is where segregation in America was set up in the school system. This state here, Kansas, they were a bit half and half. They left it up to the individual areas. Some areas in Kansas would have separate schools, others might not. And just here, the city of Topeka, and this is where Linda Brown lived. So this is where the NAACP lawyers took the case to the Supreme Court. Linda Brown versus Topeka Education Board, known as Brown versus Topeka. Now, I've already suggested the lawyers had some good evidence that the black schools were not treated equally. They went to the Supreme Court, and a man, one of their top lawyers, a man called Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood, what a great name. Maybe his supporters would say, "Oh, Thurgood, you're thoroughly good," because he's trying to argue for civil rights. Now, they said, look, these black children are being treated differently. They said that is against the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, 1868. All citizens will get equal protection of the law. Thurgood Marshall suggested, no, it is making black children feel less equal, people like Linda Brown. So the judges, there were 9 judges, they heard the case, led by the Chief Judge, a man called Chief Justice Earl Warren. He was to become very, very famous about 10 years later, after the assassination of President Kennedy. Some of you may have heard of the Warren Report, the investigation into who shot Kennedy. Well, Chief Justice Earl Warren did the Kennedy assassination report, and he's also the top judge on the Brown versus Topeka court case. What happened as a result of the court case? 17th of May 1954. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, they overturned 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. They said, no, no, no. That is not correct. Wow. I can give you the actual quote, what the Supreme Court said. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP had won. Wow. What a moment. What a moment. You would think, brilliant. That's good for the civil rights movement. But was it? The Supreme Court, they'd said, right, we really need to get rid of separate schools. But there was no time scale. 1956, a second case, they said, we need to get rid of separate schools with all deliberate speed. But what did that mean? Did it say you had to do it by a certain time? No. So there was no time scale involved. Well, how would people in these southern states react to Brown versus Topeka judgment? They've been told that they had to amalgamate and get rid of segregated schools, desegregation as it was called. Now then, let's see what happened. What was what were the consequences, the results, the significance of Brown versus Topeka? Well, here's a few for you to think about. By 1957, 723 school districts had desegregated education. 300,000 black children were now involved in desegregated schools, mainly along the border between the north and the south, these sorts of states. But what about in the deep south, down here? What about in these states, ladies and gentlemen? 2.4 million black children were still in segregated schools known as Jim Crow schools, black only. They were not allowed to join the white schools. There was a very strong reaction in the southern states, particularly those deep states, deep south. The membership of the Ku Klux Klan, a racist organisation, increased. 1958, there was something called a Southern Manifesto, the southern states, and they rejected the Supreme Court's decision. Parents of children, white children in white schools, set up the White Citizens Councils, and they were opposing the Supreme Court decision. So although the civil rights group NAACP had won in the court, it didn't necessarily transfer itself to real life. So that's one important thing to think about. Brown versus Topeka was an important judgment. There were many, many consequences. Some were positive, some were negative. Let's have a look at some of these and see what you think. Many black teachers, many black children faced threats, verbal threats, physical violence, hostility, if they dared to follow Brown versus Topeka and try to go to a previously white-only school. Some schools where only black children had gone, and they were very, very good schools, they closed down. So that's had an impact in a local area. Desegregation, as I suggested, was patchy. In some of the border states, it did actually happen. But by 1960, that's 6 years after the Supreme Court decision, 5 states in the Deep South were still completely separate, completely segregated. Brown versus Topeka had zero impact in these states. There was hostility, as I've mentioned. Particularly amongst some white people, they became very hostile to the civil rights groups, and the membership of the NAACP actually declined. 1955, 130,000 people were members. By 1957, that had gone down to 80,000. They'd lost 50,000 members. And something called white flight. What's that? Very simple. White people moved out of a community, moved out of a neighbourhood, moved away from an area if they thought that their children were going to have to go to a mixed school, a desegregated school. So really, you get segregation by a different means, because you begin to get areas where people were either all white or areas where everybody is black. Can you see that there's segregation by a different means there? So there's some of the consequences of Brown versus Topeka, and you could argue that really not much had changed. On the other hand, there were some consequences of Brown versus Topeka which did suggest change. Number one, there was more awareness of civil rights. It spread throughout the country. Remember last video I said about the television and things like that. Number two, Brown versus Topeka and the judgment acted as an inspiration for other civil rights campaigns. Look, we can win in the court. Let's try and do this. Let's try and change this. And finally, the third consequence of Brown versus Topeka, it showed the black community that they could actually win in law. They could get the law on their side. So there's Brown versus Topeka, Topeka Education Board, a very, very important first step on the road to civil rights. Now, I haven't yet mentioned what was going on in the president's head. Man at this time in the White House was, remember, a man called President Eisenhower. He'd been a soldier, a hero of World War II. What did President Eisenhower do about Brown versus Topeka? What did he do about these deep South states that refused to implement the law? What did he do? He's the president. Answer? Nothing. He said, direct quote, he said, "It would be plain nuts for me to get involved." He feared losing support in those states. So he, the President of America, even though the states were disobeying the law of the Supreme Court, he did not get involved. Wow. It was to be another education story. Something else to do with education that got President Eisenhower involved. Now, what would that be, I wonder? Ladies and gentlemen, I refer you to my next video, because in the next video we look again at the world of education and see what it was, where it was, and why President Eisenhower this time got involved. Coming soon. As ever, I hope it's been useful. We don't need no education. Wow. Well, Linda Brown needed an education, and she wanted the best education. And by going to court and Thurgood Marshall winning the court case, maybe education was changing in the United States of America. Speak to you soon. All the best now.